Lace by Nyarm. Chapter 1. Sweet in his foolishness. Sangwoo smiled as he watched his little stalker turned house guest slowly eat the food he'd so lovingly prepared for him. Bum always seemed to wither under his gaze, avoiding eye contact and focusing far too intensely on the old scuffed spoon in his hand as he ate. It's cute, really. Bum is cute. Reminds him of himself a little even. He smiles while watching his dear captive, propping his arms up on the wood table as he does so. The sudden action startles his friend a little bit and the brunette spills some soup onto his shirt. Too little for Bum to notice, but enough for him to. Speaking of clothing, Sangwoo thinks he should probably get some more clothing for Bum. The ratty striped shirt and faded grey skirt he wore didn't really suit the man. They just looked kinda trashy, like he was some kind of bargain bin bitch. He could probably go buy some later, or maybe fish something comfortable out of his trophy pile. But that could be a little difficult, considering the sheer amount of cocktail dresses his usual quarry wore. Maybe he could even pick up some suitably dressed girl around Bum's size and not spend any money. It seemed a decent enough plan. He hadn't had much fun this month, and the itch for it was there. He'd been vacantly staring at Bum for a little too long. He looked terrified, which was a grossly sweet expression on his gaunt, sallow face. It was strange to Sangwoo that he'd become fond of such a freak in so short amount of time. Maybe he was just projecting too much. It was hard to tell. Bum shook in fear just like his mother, and kept quiet just as he had done when he was a child under his father's thumb. But, regardless of whether or not there was any projecting going on, he enjoyed his time spent with his new little fixture, who claimed to love him so dearly. "What's wrong, Bum?" he asked tenderly. The other man seemed to suck up any minuscule act of attention, like it was water and he was the most pathetic and neglected plant in the world. Nothing, he answered, trying and failing to be placating to Sangwoo as he always did. The tremor running through his words was as easy to see through as ever, and the effort was so laughable to be admirable in its attempt, though it made sense that a loser like him would lack a skill as essential to life as lying. He smiled, a charming grin that he'd practiced and perfected for years. That seemed to put Bum at ease just as easily as the nightclub fodder he usually used it on. He even got a shaky smile in return, a cute reward for his efforts. Bum's awkward smiles were his best expressions. They reminded him of how obedient he was, always doing what he thought Sangwoo would want, purely out of some misplaced trust and love. The bowl of soup had dwindled down to nothing while he was caught up in his thoughts, so Sangwoo picked it up and went to wash it. He somehow managed to startle his housemate with even that small action. He really was too easily surprised, like a little pigeon. He let out a soft laugh as he flicked on the tap and quickly rinsed out the bowl. What to do today? There wasn't anything pressing on his itinerary, so the idea of going out and killing someone seemed more and more viable. It'd be fun, too. He missed the warmth of the blood and viscera staining his hands and cooling as the fire of life slowly sputtered and faded. What a joy. He could potentially find some very cute clothes for Bum, too. Girls had always seemed to find the cutest clothing. He really didn't know how they did it. He set the bowl on the drying rack and turned to face his captive, tracing his eyes over how his ill-fitting clothing fell on his slim frame. The skirt was cute, dipping between Bum's skinny legs and draping softly over his knees. Maybe he'd look good in very girly clothing. He probably would. Bum looked almost feminine in his delicate frailty. Sangwoo hadn't always been a dude lover like him, so making the already tiny man look girlish would probably make him even cuter. Would Bum even be willing to wear such clothing? He was a little reluctant to put on the plain black skirt after all. He could probably persuade the man. "Do you want something?" Bum asked him, unsure, staring wide-eyed through his dark bangs. They'd gotten a little longer since he got here. He probably needed a haircut. "Not really," Sangwoo answered noncommittally, before reconsidering. Bum reacted pretty well to affection, didn't he? "Have you ever dressed up in girls' clothes before?" Bum shifted his eyes away, as uncomfortable as Sangwoo had anticipated. No." Sangwoo sighed before walking over to where Bum sat in his chair, eyes downcast. He squatted next to him. "You'd look less shitty if you did. Aren't homosexuals like you into that anyway?" Bum flinched a little before shaking his head. "You might even look cute if you did, you know," Sangwoo said before kissing Bum lightly on his chapped lips. The older male flushed and stared at him with those blindingly adoring eyes. The stupid, docile look only made him want to kiss the black-haired man even more. So he did. Being loved made him feel special, even if he didn't completely return it. Kissing Bum was nice. The man was so eager that Sangwoo enjoyed it a little, even though his partner's lips were dry enough to be scratchy and his inexperience left something to be desired. He pulled away from the chaste kiss and revelled in the lingering warmth on his lips. If he was being entirely honest with himself, he was a little aroused from even that simple contact. It was almost embarrassing how easily he was roused by his captive. He had self-restraint, though, so he left Bum flustered in the kitchen to prepare for his night out later. Chapter 2. Biding his time. Preparation wasn't difficult. It never was. All he had to do was make sure his tools and cleaning supplies were neatly organised and all the windows in the house had been completely muffled and covered. Bum was pretty docile the rest of the day, which was nice because he just looked so sweet and demure, as he tended to be after any small display of affection. The man was just so easily flustered. Sangwoo bided his time doing various chores around the house as his captive sat awkwardly in his chair. Bum wasn't too keen on conversation unless explicitly engaged, so the taller refrained from making any. He had always enjoyed working in silence, alone with his thoughts. Bum's soft breathing kept him from the bouts of loneliness he had been prone to when he lived by himself. He couldn't deny that he felt a little excited at the prospect of what he was planning to do tonight. He really had the best hobby. Every time carried the same thrill as the first, and making the act itself seem like a wellspring of exhilaration. They carried on in this way for quite a while. Sangwoo found it useful that there was always something to be done in his house, as it was a good way to waste an afternoon away. When night finally arrived, he had no trouble tucking Bum into their shared bed and climbing under the linty sheets with him. Carrying the man anywhere was fun. He had always seemed so embarrassed to be toted around by Sangwoo, even though he couldn't possibly go anywhere efficiently on his broken legs. The blonde man thinks to himself that Bum is very silly, though that silliness may be part of his charm. He pretended to fall asleep after bidding his little friend good night. The brunette was an awful liar, and it was easy to differentiate between when he was faking sleeping and when he was actually sleeping. Bum looked very sweet when his face was relaxed and his mind was dreaming. Sangwoo still waited a little bit longer, in bed with his captive, enjoying his closeness, before slipping out of bed to go get ready. He made sure to lock the bedroom door on the way out of the room. Who knew that the outside locks that had caused him so much stress as a child would come in handy for once? Sangwoo quickly and quietly went upstairs to get dressed. A simple go-to outfit, a flattering black button-up and some jeans, more than suitable for simple excursions to bars. On his way out he smiled and winked at himself in the mirror to make sure he looked good enough to get lucky in his own way. As Sangwoo got into his car, he pondered on where to go. It was 9:15 and he would probably have to drive quite a bit, considering how close to home his last victim was. It was important to keep his hunting grounds varied, or so he had learned from various crime shows he'd watched. It had worked so far though, so he supposed it was fine advice. Ironic, considering the fact that so many of the series seemed to be a ploy to simultaneously entertain with and discourage instead of facilitate the very acts he happily committed. The joint he selected ended up being one that looked busy enough, and just the right shade of decrepit to suit his purposes. He carefully slithered through the front door on the heels of some nobody Barfley. He'd had to wait for the chance to do so too, which wasn't fun on a cold night. It was rather packed, which wasn't unusual for 10 o'clock at night, and that fact made him smile as it meant it would be fairly easy to spirit someone away without any fanfare. The yellow lighting was sensually dim too, likely to avoid hurting any drunk's eyes, and suited his purposes quite well, in that it made it harder for people to see others well enough to, say, describe them to the police. He was glad for it, and smiled again as he made his way over to a booth tucked into a corner of the place. He winced imperceptibly as he sat down. The red plastic of the booth seats had rips like cracks that exposed some of the white stuffing within them, and they were visibly dirty. He gingerly set his arms on the slightly sticky wood of the table. Getting girls to come home with him was never too hard. Most bargoers tended to be pretty dumb. He was always surprised at how often and well cliché flirting worked. That being said, he figured the old buy a girl a drink and feign interest long enough to get her to come home with him wouldn't be too hard. It was a weekday, so plenty of the women there were in simple outfits lacking the flashiness of weekend wear. Some were still dressed in their work clothes. Sangwoo chuckled softly as he imagined how hilarious it would be to stuff Bum's narrow bony hips into a pencil skirt. The thought was made even funnier by the fact that most of the women here were bigger than his captive, though his small frame made him much more attractive to Sangwoo than any of the pointless people buzzing around the bar. At any rate, a group of girls glanced at him a few times, so he figured they were definitely possibilities. They looked like they were in their mid-20s, a bit older than him, sure, but that usually just meant they were easier. He could probably sit there and wait for one of them to approach him, so he did. He ordered a drink to make himself a little more natural and pulled out his phone. He had only been on it for about 5 minutes, casually sipping on some concoction before he was approached by one, as expected. It was nice, being pretty. The girl had a pixie cut that shone dully under the light of the bar, and her expression was laughably bold.
"Hey,"
she said.
"what are you doing here all by yourself? I can't believe you don't have anybody with you."
She spoke in a tone that he reasoned was supposed to be sultry. Unfortunately, all he felt for her was second-hand embarrassment. He played along, however, and greeted her in turn. She was wearing something pretty cute, he supposed. Barrettes in her short black hair, a loose, long-sleeved pastel pink sweater over what he assumed was a lacy white dress, though it may have just been a skirt. He'd probably be finding out soon. She was tiny too. Not as tiny as Bum, but close enough, he supposed. He smiled and put up with her inexperienced flirting for the better part of an hour. She was around Bum's age, so Sangwoo began to think that their generation must be just full of awkward losers. He asked her if she'd like to move the conversation elsewhere when her babbling became too much to sit through. She giggled and agreed. How disgusting. The drive home was just as bad. The woman, whose name he hadn't bothered to remember, had apparently come to the bar with one of her friends, so she had no problem coming home with him. She prattled on endlessly through the whole ride, and he began to deeply regret going to bar so far from his house. He laughed and flirted along with her though, imagining how fun it would be to bash her face in all the while. It was always very funny. This idiot had no idea what was going to happen to her.